Imagine two students walking into the same exam hall. They sit in the same classroom, answer the same questions, and have the same amount of time. Now imagine that, when the results come out, 95% of one group passes, while only about 65% of the other group does. You wouldn't immediately assume the second group was less capable. You'd ask a different question. Wait, what's different about the way the test is being taken? Believe it or not, something surprisingly similar happens inside millions of bedrooms around the world, and almost nobody talks about it. Not because it's rare, but because it's awkward. Because the moment you bring it up, people get uncomfortable. Some laugh, some change the subject, others pretend the problem doesn't exist. But researchers couldn't ignore it. The numbers were simply too consistent. Picture this: a man and a woman having sex on the same night, in the same room, sharing the same experience. You'd probably assume they have roughly the same chance of reaching orgasm. Seems fair, right? Except, that's not what happens. Not even close. Large studies involving tens of thousands of adults have found the same pattern again, and again, and again. Around 9 out of every 10 men say they usually, or almost always, orgasm during partnered sex. For women, that number suddenly drops, sometimes to around 6 or 7 out of 10. In some studies, it's even lower. Think about that for a second. Out of every 100 couples, roughly 30 women's orgasms simply disappear. Researchers eventually gave this phenomenon a name: the orgasm gap. And before you assume this is just a tiny statistical quirk, it's not. In some studies, the difference is close to 30 percentage points. That's enormous. If a hospital had one treatment that worked for 95% of patients and another that worked for only 65%, doctors wouldn't shrug their shoulders and move on. They'd immediately start asking, what's going wrong? So that's exactly what scientists did. At first, their answer seemed obvious. Maybe women's bodies are simply more complicated. Maybe female orgasm is naturally harder to achieve. Maybe biology is the whole story. It sounds reasonable. In fact, that's what many people believed for decades. You've probably heard some version of it yourself. Women are just complicated. They take longer. The female body is mysterious. It's just how nature made them. Convenient explanation. Simple. Easy to believe. And if that's true, well, then nobody has to change anything. Nobody has to question how sex is usually portrayed. Nobody has to rethink what they learned growing up. Nobody has to ask uncomfortable questions. Case closed. Except, one group of researchers decided to actually test that idea. And that's when the entire theory started falling apart. They asked a surprisingly simple question. If female orgasm is biologically difficult, then shouldn't it be difficult all the time? Think about it. A body doesn't suddenly change depending on who's standing nearby. If something is naturally rare, it should stay rare, right? So researchers looked at something most people had completely ignored. What happens when women are alone? And what they discovered completely changed the conversation, because the so-called hard-to-orgasm body suddenly didn't seem hard anymore. In fact, the numbers climbed dramatically. The same woman, the same brain, the same anatomy, but a completely different outcome, which raises a fascinating question. If the body didn't change, what did? And that's where this story becomes much more interesting than most people realize, because the biggest obstacle was never hidden inside women's biology. It was hidden inside something almost all of us have been taught, without ever realizing it. A script so common that most people mistake it for reality. And once you see that script, you'll never look at this topic the same way again. So what exactly changed when one person left the room? And why did that single detail completely dismantle decades of assumptions? To answer that, we need to look at something your brain has been doing in the background this entire time. So, what changed? The body didn't change. The anatomy didn't change. The nervous system didn't change. The only thing that changed was who was in the room. That single detail completely overturned decades of assumptions. When researchers looked at women during solo sexual activity, orgasm rates rose dramatically, often approaching those reported by men. Think about how strange that is. The same woman, who might struggle to orgasm during partnered sex, often has no such difficulty when she's alone. If biology were the problem, this shouldn't happen. A difficult body doesn't suddenly become an easy one. So researchers realized they had been asking the wrong question. The mystery was, why does the outcome change so much depending on the situation? That's a very different question, and it led scientists somewhere they weren't expecting. Not to the body, but to the brain. Imagine your brain as the world's most overprotective security guard. Before it allows sexual pleasure to fully build, it quietly scans the environment. Am I safe? Am I comfortable? Can I relax? Is anything distracting me? Most of this happens without you even realizing it. You don't consciously think, the bedroom is a little too cold, or I hope I don't look awkward from this angle. But your brain notices everything. And here's where it gets fascinating. Researchers studying sexual response discovered that your brain doesn't simply have an on switch. It has two separate systems working at the same time. One pushes the accelerator, the other keeps a foot on the brake. Think of driving a car. You could press the accelerator as hard as you want, but if someone is also pressing the brake, you're not going very far. Sexual arousal works surprisingly similarly. The accelerator responds to things you find exciting. Touch, fantasy, affection, desire. The brake responds to almost anything your brain interprets as a reason to slow down. Stress, anxiety, embarrassment, pain, feeling rushed, feeling judged, wondering whether your phone is about to ring. Even tiny distractions that seem completely unrelated. Here's the surprising part. Research consistently suggests that, on average, women's brakes tend to be more sensitive than men's. Not because women want sex less, not because they're less passionate, but because their brains are often processing far more contextual information during sexual activity. Imagine trying to enjoy your favorite movie, while someone beside you keeps pausing it every 30 seconds. You might still enjoy it, but you'll never become completely immersed. That's what an overactive brake feels like. Now compare that with men. For many men, physical stimulation alone is often enough to keep the process moving. That's one reason medications like Viagra can be so effective for certain erectile problems. Those medications mainly improve blood flow. They're solving a largely physical issue. But here's something many people don't know. There is no equivalent female Viagra that reliably solves the same problem for most women. Why? Because in many cases, the biggest obstacle isn't mechanical. It's psychological. It's emotional. It's contextual. Imagine trying to improve your home's Wi-Fi. You buy the fastest router on the market. You upgrade every cable. You replace every device, only to discover someone unplugged the modem in the next room. You fixed the wrong problem. For decades, that's exactly what happened in conversations about female pleasure. People kept assuming something inside women's bodies needed fixing, when researchers increasingly realized the body often wasn't broken at all. Something much bigger was being overlooked. And strangely enough, that oversight was hiding in plain sight. Because the next discovery wasn't about hormones, it wasn't about personality, it wasn't even about psychology. It was about basic anatomy. Anatomy that almost everyone thinks they understand, but most people were never actually taught. And once researchers focused on one tiny body part, suddenly, the entire puzzle started making sense. If I asked you to name the body part primarily responsible for most female orgasms, many people would confidently give the wrong answer. And that misunderstanding may be one of the biggest reasons the orgasm gap exists in the first place. So, what was this body part that researchers kept coming back to? Oddly enough, it's one of the least talked about parts of human anatomy, not because it's unimportant, but because generations of people simply weren't taught much about it. Here's a quick experiment. If someone asked you, what is the main source of sexual pleasure for most men? Most people could answer instantly. Now ask the same question about women. Notice how much less certain people become. That hesitation tells its own story. Researchers studying female sexual response have found a remarkably consistent pattern. For most women, orgasm is primarily associated with direct or indirect stimulation of the clitoris, a specialized organ devoted largely to sexual sensation. And here's the surprising part. The small portion visible from the outside is only the tip. Most of its structure extends internally, surrounding nearby tissues. In other words, it's much larger than most people realize. Yet despite its importance, many people receive little or no formal education about it. Now here's where the mystery takes another turn. If one structure plays such a central role, you'd naturally expect it to receive the most attention during partnered sex, right? Except that's often not what happens. And that single mismatch may explain far more than people realize. Imagine someone hands you a piano, but only tells you about 3 of its keys. Then, years later, they ask you to play a beautiful song. If the music doesn't sound right, is the piano broken? Of course not. You were simply never shown how the instrument actually works. Researchers increasingly began wondering whether something similar had happened with sex education. For decades, many cultures quietly taught, either directly or indirectly, that one particular act represented the main event. Everything else? Just preparation, an appetizer, something optional. But for many women, research suggests that what society often labels as foreplay isn't merely preparation at all. It's a central part of the experience. In other words, the script had been written around the wrong assumption. Think about almost every romantic movie you've ever seen. The sequence is surprisingly predictable. A kiss, a brief montage, fade to black. The audience automatically assumes both people had the same experience. Nobody asks any questions. Nobody wonders whether both partners' needs were actually addressed. The story simply moves on. Over thousands of movies, television shows, novels, and conversations, that pattern quietly became normal. Not because anyone deliberately planned it, but because culture repeats what culture already knows. And over time, people stop questioning the script. Then researchers looked somewhere completely unexpected. Not at anatomy, not at hormones, but at different kinds of relationships. And what they found made the mystery even harder to ignore. Women in same-sex relationships consistently reported substantially higher rates of orgasm than women in heterosexual relationships. Think about what that means. The anatomy didn't change. The nervous system didn't change. Women's bodies didn't suddenly become less complicated. The biggest variable that changed was how sexual encounters were approached. Different expectations, different communication, different focus. Suddenly, the long-standing theory that female orgasm was simply biologically difficult became much harder to defend. Because if biology were the main explanation, those numbers shouldn't shift so dramatically. But they do, again and again, across multiple studies. Researchers couldn't ignore that. By now, the mystery was becoming clearer. It wasn't pointing toward defective anatomy. It wasn't pointing toward impossible biology. It was pointing toward something much less obvious. A cultural script. A script that quietly teaches millions of people what sex is supposed to look like, often without anyone realizing they're following one. And once researchers recognized that, another strange question appeared. If so many couples are following a script that doesn't work equally well for everyone, Why hasn't anyone noticed? Surely people would realize something was missing, right? Well, that's where the story takes its most unexpected turn. Because many couples genuinely believe everything is working perfectly, even when it isn't. And the reason why has less to do with biology and far more to do with something people have been doing for decades, without ever talking about it. Researchers estimate that an astonishing number of women have pretended to reach orgasm at least once. At first glance, it seems harmless, even kind. But that single decision may unintentionally keep the entire cycle going. And once you understand why, the whole puzzle finally comes together. So, why hasn't this problem simply fixed itself? After all, if something isn't working, wouldn't couples naturally figure it out over time? You'd think so, but researchers discovered something that quietly changes the entire story. It isn't just about anatomy or communication. It's about feedback. Imagine you're learning to play darts. Every throw completely misses the board, but after each throw, someone smiles and says, "Perfect. Don't change a thing." How long would it take before you improved? Probably never, because you're being told you're already succeeding. Now replace darts with intimacy. Researchers estimate that a large proportion of women have faked an orgasm at least once in their lives. Think about that. Not a tiny minority. Millions of people. At first, that sounds shocking. But when researchers asked why, the answers were surprisingly human. Some didn't want to hurt their partner's feelings. Some wanted the experience to end without awkwardness. Some felt pressure to keep up. Others believed something was wrong with them, so pretending felt easier than explaining. Very few described it as manipulation. Most described it as protection. Protection of the relationship. Protection of their partner's confidence. Protection from an uncomfortable conversation. Ironically, that kindness can create a completely different problem. Imagine cooking dinner for someone you love. Every single time, they tell you, "That was amazing." Years later, you accidentally discover they never actually liked the food. Wouldn't your first reaction be, "Why didn't you tell me?" Because without honest feedback, nothing ever changes. That's exactly what can happen here. If one partner believes everything worked perfectly, there's no reason to try something different next time. The cycle quietly repeats itself, not because anyone has bad intentions, but because both people are working with incomplete information. It's a misunderstanding that reinforces itself again and again and again. By this point, the mystery doesn't seem so mysterious anymore. Researchers weren't uncovering evidence that women's bodies are unusually difficult. They were uncovering evidence that many couples had inherited a script that rarely encouraged curiosity. Think about how most people learn about sex. Not from comprehensive education, not from careful conversations, but from scattered pieces of information. Friends, movies, television, pornography, social media. Each source tells part of the story, but very few tell the whole story. And when incomplete information gets repeated for decades, it starts feeling like common sense, even when it isn't. So, what actually helps? Interestingly, the research points to something far less dramatic than people expect. Not secret techniques, not miracle supplements, not expensive products. The biggest differences appear in couples who do something surprisingly simple. They communicate, openly, honestly, without embarrassment. They ask questions, they give feedback, they stay curious about each other instead of assuming they already know all the answers. Researchers also found that couples who don't treat one particular sexual activity as the only definition of real sex often report greater mutual satisfaction. In other words, they stop following the old script and start writing one that actually fits them. And remember that finding we talked about earlier? Women in same-sex relationships consistently reporting much higher orgasm rates than women in heterosexual relationships? That wasn't presented to argue that one relationship is better than another. It highlighted something much more interesting. When the same female anatomy produces very different outcomes under different circumstances, the explanation probably isn't the anatomy. It's the circumstances, the communication, the expectations, the script. That's about as close as behavioral science gets to a natural experiment. And the conclusion is remarkably consistent. The problem was never that female pleasure was impossible. The problem was that many people were following instructions that weren't designed around how female pleasure usually works. So, let's go back to the question we started with. Why is the female orgasm supposedly so difficult to achieve? After decades of research, the answer is surprisingly simple. For most women, it isn't. Not biologically. The body isn't the mystery. The anatomy isn't the mystery. The brain isn't broken. What's been difficult is overcoming generations of assumptions, generations of silence, generations of treating one version of sex as the default, while quietly overlooking the experiences of half the population. And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. For years, countless women wondered, is something wrong with my body? Research increasingly suggests that was probably the wrong question. A better question might be, what if we've been following the wrong script all along? Because once you ask that question, the so-called mystery starts disappearing. Not because science suddenly invented something new, but because it finally began listening to experiences that had always been there. And perhaps the most hopeful part of this entire story is that, unlike biology, scripts can be rewritten, and when they are, the gap doesn't have to stay a gap forever.